Hello, welcome to the first lesson of Chapter 2. It's going to be one of 4 lessons, and we're going to begin with the father of Western philosophy, Aristotle. And this can be found in your books on pages 23 through 86. So let's begin. If you're watching this because you were absent, we did classwork 4 on Power School. It was just a discussion post where people told me their prior knowledge. So if you're watching this because you were absent, please be sure that you're excused from that assignment. Okay, you're going to notice that there is a lot of vocabulary on this page. One of the things about your textbook is it doesn't have a glossary, and it doesn't put like vocabulary words in bold or provide any definitions beyond the context clues in the readings, really. So this was the list I made for myself. You can find this list on the Chapter 2 page in the right-hand column on Power School. So if you're looking at the Chapter 2 page, it'll be over here in the right-hand column. So you can find this list if you want to download it, and then as you're reading, write definitions in or write the page number you find it on, you can. It's not required, but it will be helpful to you. And also in that resources on this right column on Power School, you'll also find the Kahoots for this chapter. And there's 2 quizzes. Quiz 2.1, which will close during the first week of the lesson, and quiz 2.2. So the first quiz, 2.1, covers this half of the chapter. The second quiz, 2.2, covers this half. It's a little dense, so I divided it. And you can check Power School again for the dates of those quizzes. So our learning objectives for this lesson, or actually this is really for the whole chapter, will be to summarize the different approaches in ethics in Aristotle, Kant, utilitarian and rights-based ethics. We're going to compare and contrast the different ethical approaches, explain the ways in which they agree with Christian worldviews and their points of departure, and then by the end of the chapter, you will be able to synthesize your own approach to ethics from what you find valuable from each of the approaches you studied. So this is going to be your final assessment. You'll basically write a paragraph where you analyze the different approaches and come up with your own approach. So we begin with Aristotle. As you can see, 384 through 322, he's considered the father of Western philosophy. And you might be wondering, why would we start with a person who is so from such a long time ago? Why Aristotle? And why wouldn't we start maybe with somebody in the Enlightenment like Descartes or Rousseau or something? And the reason why we start with Aristotle is because he was the first one to actually try to do a systematic study of ethics. And he wrote the first kind of work on ethics. And it was called, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but it was called Nicomachean Ethics, and it was named after his son. And this is still a classic text of ethics. And so one of the other things to consider is prior to the Enlightenment, all rational inquiry was seen as a form of science. So post-Enlightenment, science is limited to investigations using the scientific method, which the scientific method doesn't really apply to subjects like studying ethics or history or literature. It's very limited. But what Aristotle set out to do was to use human reason and come up with a systematic study of ethics that would tell us what is the ultimate goal of all human action. And what he came up with, again, is this Nicomachean ethics. And that's what we're going to be looking at. What did Aristotle say was the ultimate goal of human life? Okay, so the first thing we have to start with is looking at human nature. My professor for European political thought basically said you can look at any philosopher's understanding of human nature, and from that understanding, you can extrapolate his ethical theories or his political theories or whatever he's philosophizing about. So this is Aristotle's theory of human nature, and it's super important for understanding Catholic ethics because um, Saint Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the Summa Theologica, its summary of all theology, he he follows Aristotle very much, and he kind of follows this idea of telos. So if you're going to understand anything about Catholic ethical teaching, you have to understand this idea of telos. So telos is the goal or purpose toward which human beings aim. So the idea is Aristotle observed nature, and he saw that in nature, everything kind of has an end for which it was created, or it has an order. There is an order to nature. And so, for example, he noticed that eyes are for seeing. He also noticed that acorns are ordered to be oak trees. They're meant to be oak trees. So the telos of an acorn is to be an oak tree, and the telos of the eyes is to see. So, this is something that's pretty self-evident from nature. And so then Aristotle asked then, what is the telos? What is the purpose of human beings? And he, after observing human beings and our actions and our motivations, said that the telos of a human being is happiness. What is the goal toward which all of us are striving? And it's to be happy. And in Greek, it's, and I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce this, eudaimonia, happiness. And so the way he came to this conclusion was asking a question, why do you do what you do? So for example, I got up today and came to work. Why do I go to work? Because I want to make money. Why do I want money? Because I need money to support my family. Why do I want my family? Because they make me happy. And so different people will come to different kind of conclusions about what makes them happy. But there's both a subjective and an objective nature to happiness. So the telos of human beings dictates that by nature, human beings can only reach our goal in a certain way. So this is what we would call the objective aspect of telos. So this is objective. It's not different for each person. And what Aristotle argued was the way we meet our telos, how do I get to my, why is there an A there? Telos. How do I reach my telos? How do I reach my harmony and happiness? It's through the practice of virtue. So virtue is a necessary condition for human happiness. So virtue is the objective aspect. But there's also the subjective objective aspect is virtue. But the subjective aspect might be that I find happiness through my family. A priest may not have a family. Does that mean he's not happy? No, he finds his telos, finds his happiness through serving God. An example they gave you in the book would be on page, let's see. An example in the book is from page 25 of the objective and subjective nature of telos of our goal. Suppose everybody in the classroom were given a brand new automobile and everyone wanted to keep his car in tip-top shape. Now, some might decide to paint their cars red, others orange, and others black. Things like the color of a car or the material of the seats each person chooses are purely subjective matters that depend on the whims and preferences of an individual. But there are other aspects of maintaining a car that are not subjective, they're objective. For example, the kind of fuel and regular maintenance that are scheduled are objective. So, for example, if I really love Diet Coke, I can't say, I really love Diet Coke. I think my car should drink Diet Coke too. The car won't run if I put Diet Coke in my car. So that's an objective nature about what's going to bring about telos for the car. So this begs another question. If I think I'm happy, doesn't that mean I'm happy? If you might say, well, or ask the question, what about bad people? If virtue is a condition for happiness, we wouldn't say that somebody like John Gotti is virtuous. He was a mobster. What Aristotle would argue is because human nature doesn't change, human nature is not subjective. He argues that it is part of human nature that we have to be virtuous to be happy. So if you have a vicious man, like, and vicious here meaning a man who has vices, like John Gotti had, he was a mobster, he committed crimes and things like that. If you have a person who's vicious, they might think they're happy, but they really aren't. In the same way, for example, they give an example in your book on page 26 where a father and son are sitting together, and the little boy is eating this ice cream sundae. And the father says to the son, I know you really enjoy that dessert, but I want to tell you about what will happen when you get older. The son watched him attentively. When you get older, things will change, and someday you will fall in love with a beautiful woman. The two of you will marry, have children, and grow older together, and you will be happier than you will ever have been. To all this, the son responds, but will I also get to eat my banana split? Chuckling, the father replies, well, I don't think you'll really be concerned with banana splits at that point in your life. Hearing this response, the boy concludes, well, if I can't have my sundae, I think I'll just pass on the other stuff. So what that story illustrates is, from the mind of a little kid, he thinks having an ice cream sundae is pure happiness, but he hasn't, had other experiences like having a family, having a wife, having children. No one, as Aristotle wrote, would want to have the mind of a child for their whole life. We're always striving. Why do we always want something more, something better? Because we haven't reached our telos yet. And again, telos can only be reached through the practice of virtue, because again, human nature doesn't change. This is something that's an objective fact about human nature. So if you have someone who says they're happy or even thinks they're happy without virtue, it's the same way as an addict who thinks they're happy when they're high. Anybody from the outside looking in can see that they're addicted to drugs and they're not happy and they're not free. But the addict thinks they're happy when they're in the middle of a drug binge. Again, people can be mistaken or deluded, but the only way to reach happiness is through the practice of virtue. So this is like an antidote to relativism, because cultures may be different. In one culture, happiness may be having a big family. In another culture, happiness may be having a small family. But whatever the happiness is, the only path to that happiness is through the practice of virtue. So let's take a look at that. Okay, what we're going to look at now, so we looked at something about human nature, that human beings, like everything else in nature, have a goal, our telos, and our telos is ordered toward happiness. So you also have to understand a little bit about the human person. So every person has two different parts. We have a rational part. So this is me thinking, deliberating, and judging. So, and the judgment part is what ethics is concerned with. We're not concerned with these aspects of the human self. We're concerned with the part of us that judges, our rational part. Again, in our culture, judgment has kind of a negative connotation, but uh, making a judgment call isn't bad. It's neither bad nor good. It's just making a decision about the quality of something. So we have our rational part, but we also have a non-rational aspect. And we share this with both plants and other animals. So the vegetative part is involuntary functions. For example, your heartbeat. You don't choose to have a heartbeat. You don't will your heart to beat. It just beats. Digestion, heartbeat, and that's all that plants really have. They just photosynthesize and grow. They do everything involuntarily. The other aspect to us is our appetitive part. And this includes desires such as for food or sex or pleasure, and also our emotions, which are also sometimes called the passions in Aristotelian philosophy. So this part, the appetitive part, is partly rational. And the reason why we say it's partly rational, that doesn't look like an R, is because of this over here. Humans can use their reason, me thinking, and my will, this is me acting, to control their appetites and passions. So that's why we say they're partly rational. So, and this is super important for understanding Aristotle in the virtue ethics. Nowadays, sometimes we'll say expressions like, well, I can't help the way I feel. And by saying that, we're kind of acting as if we don't control our emotions. And that's simply not true. That's what makes humans different than animals. Animals have appetitive parts and they have the vegetative part. But for example, my dog, when my dog sees another dog walking down the street, she has an emotional reaction. She gets angry because she sees the dog as a threat and starts barking. And I can beat my dog in order to condition her not to do it. But my dog can't actually really control her passions, nor can animals control their desire for example, for sex. When I was at USC, there was always these wild dogs that roamed around the neighborhood. And if a boy dog came across a girl dog and the girl dog was in heat, they would mate. There was no choice there. It was just them acting on this desire. Unlike human beings, human beings have a choice. We do have natural desires and emotions, but unlike animals, we can control them. And when we act as if we can't, that's when we're basically being inhumane. We're not being what we are called to be. We're not doing our telos. We're not being human. So let's take a look about how is it that we can do this? How can I control my desires and passions? Okay, so virtue is a good habit. I should probably put that there because vices would be bad habits. Habit can train the passions and appetites. So that's what virtue is. And the way your book describes it is they say practice makes permanent. So what they mean by that is if you keep practicing a behavior, you can change how you feel and react to certain situations. So an example you could use is irascible persons. One of the personality or character types is irascibility. Irascibility, it basically means that you have a temper. So, and I can relate to this because I do tend to have a temper. So for instance, if you're waiting in line at the calf and a girl cuts in front of you to take your place, how do you react to it? If you're a person with an irascible character, you'll get mad. You won't be even though you know it's not reasonable in your mind to deck someone for cutting in your place or curse at them. You don't have your reason isn't in line with your passion, so you might punch her. And so if over time a person with an irascible temper tries to control it, so maybe a girl cuts in front of you, you are about to get angry, but your reason takes control of your passions and says, no, Just ask her to go to the back of the line. If you keep practicing, you will actually, through habit, be able to change your feelings and reactions. I think a lot of us, just from anecdotal evidence, know how this is true. Think of a character trait that you've trained yourself to get better at. I know I used to have a really bad temper. And through managing my temper, like when I get mad, I count to 10, I've been able to get a better handle over that. So the virtuous person is the person who's habituated themselves to both judge with their reason the appropriate way to behave, so the virtue, and to feel or desire the appropriate way. So once reason and your emotions are in harmony, H-A-R-M-O-N, that's when you've reached your telos or happiness. So Aristotle is saying, ultimately, if you want to be a happy person, you need to, through the practice of the virtues, have harmony between your reason and your emotions, and so that you can do the right thing, and that's what's going to make you happy. As the quote says here, we are what we repeatedly do. That's your character, right? We are what we do. That's your character. Then it is not an act. If we are what we do repeatedly, excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So this is something we can totally do and acquire through our own effort. Let's take a look at some of the character types that result by practicing either virtue or the lack thereof, which would be a vice. So these are 4 character types that Aristotle identified. And so as you're listening to this, try to consider, based on what you're learning about the human person in this chart above, can you explain why Aristotle argues the virtuous person is the most happy? Because sometimes in our world today, people who aren't virtuous look happier. Like, look at movie stars. A lot of them do terrible things, but they have money, they're beautiful. Or I was listening to Bishop Barron's podcast the other day, and a caller called in and asked, wasn't it more fun to be bad than good? Aristotle would say absolutely not. And here's why. The virtuous person does not struggle. Their appetite is in harmony with reason. So is reason able to judge right from wrong? Yes. Is the appetite in line with reason? Yes. Does the agent do the right thing? Yes. This is telos. This is where you're in perfect harmony, and this is what happiness is. Let's compare that with some other character types. The incontinent or enduring, this is where emotions and desires eventually but reluctantly follow the guide of reason. And the easiest way to understand this is by using the example of a vice or virtue and seeing how it works. So in terms of desire for food, your appetite for food, if you're someone who struggles with gluttony, the vice of gluttony, you want to eat too much. So is reason able to judge right from wrong? For the enduring or continent person, your reason knows that it's wrong to eat too much. So for example, there's a box of See's candy. You know that if you eat 10 See's candies, that's going to up your blood sugar. It's a lot of fat. It's not good for you. But are your appetites in line with reason? No. Your desire is overriding reason. So you still want those 10 candies, even though you know it's wrong. The virtuous person, because their appetite is in reason, they don't even want the 10 candies. They can eat one and it's no problem for them. So eventually, does the continent person do the right thing? Yes. Eventually, they will, after battling with themselves, not eat the 10 candies. Now let's look at the incontinent or soft person. They lose the battle with the appetitive part, because the appetitive part is not in line with reason. They still know it's wrong, but they fail. The continent person struggles and still does the right thing, but with effort. The incontinent person struggles and fails. Next, you have the vicious or self-indulgent person. And these are people who are so corrupted by bad actions um, and through circumstances that their rational part can no longer judge right from wrong. So that why it says, are the appetites in line with reason? Why does it say yes here? It's because that this person's mind is so corrupted, they think the wrong thing is right. And so if you're this is kind of hard for us to understand, but when people are criminals, like they think for example, John Gotti killing his enemies, he probably thought that was the right thing. Any kind of virtuous or sane person would say no, but reason is no longer able to judge right from wrong. um, their appetites are in line with reason insofar as their appetites are wrong and they have no proper reason. So, do they do the right thing? No. So, when you look at this, the reason why the person who is virtuous is happy is because they're not struggling. Now, the vicious person may think they're happy. They're not struggling either, but they're not doing the right thing. So they can't reach their telos. They'll never be happy. The vicious man will never be fulfilled. It's just like a drug addict who, if you've ever watched shows like Intervention, they think they're happy, but that's like a little kid saying they're happy. But they haven't even experienced life. The virtuous are capable of a unique level of pleasure beyond that of children or diseased men, Aristotle would say. So the virtuous person, again, telos is all about harmony. Your mind, your rational part, and your appetitive part is in total harmony. It's all about having reached. Sometimes telos is actually translated as perfection, perfect, because you're not struggling with yourself anymore, and that's why this being virtuous will truly make you happy. Okay, so this chart is going to show you the different virtues in the excess or deficit, which would be a vice. So how do I become virtuous? You have to follow the golden mean. So the golden mean is right here. For every activity, so for nearly every passion and action, the virtuous person will steer an intermediate course. So you're aiming for the golden mean. Too much would be a vice. Too little would be a vice. So for example, it's let's see. So again, with irascibility, this would be to excess would be you would have a temper. So you would be yelling at people and getting in fights. The deficit of that would be irascibility. This is a word we don't use today. I use the words from the book, but this is basically being passive. So what that would look like is if someone cut in front of you in line at the calf, instead of saying politely, excuse me, can you go to the end of the line? You were to just be like, oh, whatever, you could go in front of me. Well, that's too little too little emotion, too little passion. You should have righteous anger, proper anger, and get your place back in line. And notice the caveat here. This is important for nearly every passion. Aristotle said that there were certain passions that can never don't have a mean, or certain actions that don't have a mean. So examples of that would be something like murder. So if your passion or desire, your action is murder, there's no mean. You can't, like, what if you want to kill 5 people, but you're like, no, only kill 2. That's the golden mean. No. On page 35 of your book, Aristotle writes, they have a quote from him. But not every action or every passion admits of a mean, for some have names that already imply badness: spite, shamelessness, envy. And in the case of actions, adultery, theft, murder, for all of these are in such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad, and not the excess or deficiencies of them. It is not possible then to ever be right with regard to them. So, anger can be virtuous when it's not in excess, but something like the act of murdering somebody or envying somebody, that can never be virtuous. So there are that's what Catholics would call an intrinsic or objective evil. And those are listed in the Catechism you can find them 1755, 1756, and paragraph 2271. We'll look at those later on. You don't have to know them for now. So with these are the activities, the vice, the virtue, and the vice on the other end. And so you won't have to be able to define all these for the test. What we ended up doing in class was an activity where each family or each team picked one of the virtues and then gave an example of the two vices. So if you were absent, you'll be excused from that. Okay, so on this slide, you see other tips from Aristotle. So observe virtuous people. That makes sense. Obviously, if you want to be virtuous, it helps to get help from other people. I know for me, I told you I'm an irascible person. I have a temper. One of the things I did was one time I screamed at my students when I got mad at them. I asked my master teacher, what should I have done instead? And she said, take a deep breath, count to 10, then react. And it helped me to get my reason in line with my temper and kind of quell it. Also, avoid the extreme that is more opposed to the mean. So this is where it gets a little bit subjective. So it depends on what you struggle with. If, for example, you're someone who, in terms for your desire for food, if you're like an anorexic and you're not eating enough food, that would be a vice. That would be the vice where it's a deficit. Then if that's your problem, you need to watch out for that. Typically, most people, which one's more opposed to the mean? For most people, it would probably be more gluttony, but you have to know yourself. Which vice do you struggle with? Aristotle says, always be wary of pleasure, for of all things, it's the most likely to lead you astray. So most people do struggle with gluttony more than with, say, insensitivity to food or a lack of desire for food. And then the bent stick remedy is if the mean is in the middle and you are tending to go for excess, try to bend your stick all the way back. And then in that way, hopefully it'll even it out. So if you've ever tried to unbend a hanger, or if you bend it all the way back, even further beyond the middle line, that might help you get back to the middle. So those are some tips from Aristotle. Okay, so this was the assignment I was telling you about. The students in the teams picked one virtue or vice, virtue and vice combination, and found examples in popular culture. If you were absent, then you'll just be excused from this assignment. So just let me know. Okay, so our final task is to kind of compare and contrast Aristotle with Christianity. One of the things about Aristotle is he's a pagan or a pre-Christian. So from that perspective, he lacks the revelation of Jesus Christ. So there's going to be some things that are lacking in Aristotle's understanding of ethics. However, the author says that of all the ethical theories we study, this is the most similar to the Christian ethic. So, one of the things about Aristotle is, in terms of his virtues, he would say that you only really have to love your neighbor. And Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. But for Aristotle, your neighbor would literally be your family and your friends. You don't have to show love beyond that. The idea of self-sacrifice, of the self-emptying that Jesus does for us, that wouldn't really make sense in Aristotle's system, because if you kill yourself, you can't experience the telos of happiness. So it really, he wouldn't understand, why would Jesus empty himself on the cross? Sacrifice is valued in our faith, and we serve all, which really wouldn't make much sense in Aristotle's system. Also, prayer and contrition. We're taught, to go to God, to make up for what we've done, to be sorry. In Aristotle's system, it's more about just training yourself, training your body, because you train yourself in the virtues the same way you would train your body or train to play an instrument. That's why you're happier when you've met your telos. Just like when you're learning to play an instrument, it's hard at first, and you have to practice, and it's annoying. But once you become practice in it, you could pick up some sheet music and play whatever you want. That's what telos is all about. It's about getting your self into virtue so that you don't struggle with sin or anything like that anymore. So that's another thing that that's different. We believe in original sin, and we believe that we can't do this all on our own. We need a savior. So we need Christ. We can't just, because for Aristotle, there's no God, at least not a personal God. And so, you could do it all by yourself. So, that's kind of a good thing, but it also kind of lacks moral virtue. For example, like humility. Humility was seen as too little pride in Aristotle's system. But for the Christian, things like humility, this is a good thing. So we have Christ and God to guide us, and we have also the theological virtues. The theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. And we would argue that Jesus reveals these to us and gives faith, hope, and love through the grace of the sacraments. And ultimately, our telos wouldn't be complete without that, because our telos is ultimately friendship with God. St. Thomas Aquinas said that, unlike Aristotle, we can reach our telos in this life. St. Thomas said, no, it's only through friendship with God that in the afterlife that we can truly be happy, but we're preparing for all that right now. So we know that St. Thomas uses Aristotle a lot. We also agree that the end of human beings is happiness, but St. Thomas says we find it with God. Aristotle says we find it in this life. We also agree that there's a telos, that nature is ordered towards certain ends. And that's going to be super important later on for understanding Catholic moral theology. And we also believe in the virtues. The Bible talks about many of the virtues that Aristotle did. We see in Christianity, like in the influence of pagan thought on Paul. We see the wisdom writers extolling the virtues. So there's a lot of similarity as well. All right, so that ends our lesson on Aristotle. If you have any questions, please let me know. And finally is your assessment. Okay, Your assessment for this chapter is to answer number 12. Oh, it's moving around. Whoops. Number 12 on page 45 of the textbook in a paragraph or paragraphs. So if you're having trouble, then you can come get help from me. If you feel like you've read the book and listened to this and you're still struggling, just come see me. The question reads as follows. Do you think Jesus would have agreed with Aristotle that the virtuous course of action usually consists in finding a mean or middle course between two extremes? Explain your answer using examples from Jesus' life or from his teachings. So for this one, I would just pick one virtue or to look at and explain how you think Jesus would answer this question. And as it says, you need to use examples from Jesus' life or his teachings. So you need to have at least one example from the Bible that you're either going to paraphrase or you're going to quote. You don't really need more than one. I think it's sufficient, but please make sure to do this and upload it to PowerSchool. Again, if you have any questions, just let me know.